Massive hordes of screaming fans rush to Heathrow Airport. Dozens of British policemen link arms, desperate to get the frenzied crowd under control. The boys are lucky to make it from their plane to their car unharmed by the sea of clawing hands, hungry for a scrap of clothing or a lock of hair. They are, after all, the most popular group in the world right now. And no, this isn't the Beatles.
Halfway through 1966, the pop scene was literally turned upside down by a lethal package from America, and the Beach Boys had topped the polls throughout the world's most popular group, as was proved time and time again during their tour of Britain.
Brian Wilson, leader of the famous Beach Boys, and one of today's most important pop musicians, is a symbol of the change many young musicians see in our future.
The Beach Boys have become a multi-million selling sensation at the forefront of artistic innovation. The Beatles, the greatest rock band in history, have finally met their match. Even with the landmark records Pet Sounds and Good Vibrations behind him, Brian Wilson is far from done. He has up his sleeve what he calls a teenage symphony to God, a psychedelic ode to American history, the elements of nature, and coming of age. And it's about to become the greatest album lost to time.
With a happy album cover, the really happy sounds inside, and a happy in-store display piece, you can't miss. We're sure to sell 1 million units in January. The Beach Boys, Smile.
Our story begins, like all great stories do, with some guy. And this guy happens to be a guy named Brian Wilson, a 19-year-old high school student from Hawthorne, California. In 1961, Brian thought it'd be a cool idea to write a song. His brother Dennis said, "Hey, why don't you write a song about my favorite sport, surfing?" So Brian sat down at the piano and wrote a song about surfing. He called it Surfing. When he presented the surfing song to his music teacher,
"Well, that surfing composition got an F."
So Brian got his band together and set the song to tape. The band was made up of his two brothers, Carl and Dennis Wilson, his cousin Mike Love, and his classmate Al Jardine. They called themselves Carl and the Passions. Later, they settled on the name Kenny and the Cadets, and then finally, they figured out the perfect band name, the Pendletones. Candix Records were so grateful for this cool new song from Brian and the rest of the band that they went ahead and upgraded their band name to the Beach Boys without even them having to ask. The name stuck, and history was made. When their dad, Murray Wilson, noticed that the single had sold 40,000 copies by the end of the year, the money signs went into his eyes. He signed them up for a 3-album-a-year contract with Capitol Records and graciously took on the task of being their manager. What followed in the ensuing years was a veritable storm of girls, cars, and surfing-themed hits. Surfin' Safari, Surfin' USA, Surfer Girl, Be True to Your School, 409, Shut Down, Little Honda, Little Deuce Coupe, Little Saint Nick, I Get Around, Fun Fun Fun, Dance Dance Dance, Do You Wanna Dance, Wendy, Barbara Ann, Help Me Rhonda, California Girls, All Summer Long, Don't Worry Baby, In My Room, When I Grow Up to Be a Man, and I'm Bugged At My Old Man.
I'm bugged at my old man, 'cause he's making me stay in my room. Darn my dad.
Their dad and manager Murray was an interesting character, unable to make waves in the youth culture scene with his own musical genius.
Kentucky Fried Chicken, it's chicken that's so great, real finger licking, and no one can debate.
It was only natural Murray would take his career frustrations out on his hapless and very successful progeny. Of course, they were too old now for his usual method of expressing his frustrations.
One kind of spanking is like, but the way I had it, instead of just a little tap, his voice and his thing was more.
Brian is deaf in one ear, by the way, and allegedly we have Murray to thank for that. Now, instead of beating them with a belt, he beat them with relentless criticism. He'd show up uninvited to recording sessions, constantly criticizing the group and making adjustments at a recording console that, despite what the recording engineers told him, was not plugged in.
Fellas, I have 3,000 words to say. Quit screaming and start singing from your hearts, huh?
Dad, only 82 words.
I said 3,000. Come on, Brian, knock it off.
It's 95.
When you sing Rhonda, make it sexy and soft. Rhonda, you look so fine.
Since you put me down.
No. Since you put me down, boo-dee-dee-ba-ba-dee-dee-ba-dee-da. Go on that kick.
Since you put me down.
No.
Since you put me down.
No, you're Since you put me down, baby, da-ba-doo-dee-da-doo-da-da.
Brian, forget who you are, will you? I'm a genius too. Let's go, huh? So you're big stars. Let's fight, huh? Let's fight for success. What's the matter? You made too much money, buddy?
No, don't worry about it. God damn it.
I'll leave, Brian, if you're going to give me a bad time.
I got 1 year left and your big loud voice is killing me.
You want me to leave, Brian? Mother and I can leave now.
Did you really get drunk?
I'm sorry, dear. We'll never come to another recording session. The kid got a big success and he thinks he owns the business. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, dear.
Go ahead now, say what you want to say.
Come on now.
I don't want to stop you. I just want to make sure this is on tape.
This is an absolute insult.
Well, you're doing the same to me.
You're an ingrate
20
when you do
people.
this. I've protected you for 22 years, but I can't go on if you're not going to listen to an intelligent man. I try to give you tips, and you think because you've had a few hits, you got it made. When you guys get so big that you can't sing from your hearts, you're going downhill.
Downhill.
Downhill. Success never comes from a phony singing for money. You sing from your heart.
Since you put me down, boo-dee-dee-ba-ba-dee-dee-ba-dee-da.
During a session in 1964, he poked Brian in the chest and yelled, "I made you and the Beach Boys, hear me? You'd be nothing without me." Brian threw his dad against the wall and screamed, "You're fired! Do you understand? You're fired!" So, that was that. Brian and the band experienced a new degree of freedom, safe from Murray's tyranny and creative suffocation. But even this new freedom wasn't enough to save Brian from the constant pressure of success. He didn't have a moment to himself between writing, recording, and touring, which he hated because the sound systems hurt his ear, and he didn't like crowds. Not to mention Capitol Records was always hounding him for new material, and also...
The Beatles!
The massive apocalyptic popularity of the Beatles posed a significant challenge to Brian, who was very competitive. As the Beatles' compositions became more creatively ambitious, so did Brian's. This creative ambition required more time writing at home, time that Brian didn't have, especially now that he was married. Quite famously, while on the plane to their next Beach Boys tour, Al looked over to Brian on the airplane seat next to him, and Brian was wide-eyed, and he was whimpering, "I'm gonna crack up any minute." And he was hyperventilating and screaming and crying into his pillow, flopping out into the aisles and crawling around on all fours. He barely pulled through the show that night, and then he was driven home. He laid low with his mom for a couple of weeks, and after he recovered, he told the band he wasn't gonna tour anymore. He would still be in the Beach Boys, but from now on he was just gonna stay home and write the music while the rest of them toured. And they weren't very happy with this decision at first, but ultimately it allowed Brian to expand his creativity and innovation further than ever before. With Murray gone, the Beatles on the scene, and Brian at home, the stage was set for an artistic explosion. Have you heard of a guy named Phil Spector? 'Cause Brian definitely did. Spector's song, Be My Baby, was on constant repeat in the Wilson household, to the great annoyance of Brian's wife and daughters. In fact, it's no exaggeration to say the famed producer was Brian Wilson's idol.
What do you think God is?
God? Of course, Phil Spector, his record.
Do you not see him as a person, or do you see him as...
I see him as a god and a person both, but mostly a god.
Spector was famous for his wall of sound technique, which was basically throwing as many instruments as you can at the recording, with lots of instruments playing the same parts, so they basically merge into one instrument, and the total effect feels like just a wall of sound hitting you. Inspired by this, Brian began enlisting the help of Spector's session musicians, a group of classical and jazz musicians known as the Wrecking Crew, so called because they were concerned that their contribution to rock recordings would wreck the music industry. Up to this point, Beach Boys fans had only heard guitar, drums, piano, and some of Mike Love's saxophone toots. Listeners were now treated to a full orchestra of rich textures and sounds. Brian's compositional skills also got a huge glow up. He began incorporating all these crazy chords and classical compositional techniques, and then...
I listened to Rubber Soul, and I said,
I said, how could they possibly make an album where the songs all sounded like they came from the same place? And I couldn't deal with it. It blew my mind. And I said, damn it, I've got to do that. I've got to try that with the boys. And I got to the piano and I said, God damn it, let's get going here. Let's write a great goddamn album.
So you may have heard of Pet Sounds. It's frequently cited as the greatest or one of the greatest albums ever made in pop history. Brian really sought to distance himself from the Surfing Cars thing with this one. He not only replaced the other Beach Boys instrumentally with the Wrecking Crew, he stopped collaborating with Mike Love on lyrics, turning instead to Jingles composer Tony Asher. Tony Asher said that Brian was the most irresponsible person he had ever worked with. Brian would leave $100,000 checks lying around the house. He would sleep until noon, then kill time for hours before getting to work, or even stopping work to watch the Dolphin sitcom Flipper, and cry at all the emotional scenes.
Go get Playboy, Flipper! He's headed out into the ocean, he'll drown! Bring him back, go get him!
And while listening to playbacks of his own music, Brian would burst into uncontrollable fits of laughter, crying, and rage. Brian became even more eccentric in the studio, expanding his arsenal of sounds to include plucked piano strings, electro-theremin, bicycle horns, train whistles, and his two dogs, Banana and Louie.
Hey, Chuck, is it possible we can bring a horse in here without, if we don't screw anything up?
I beg your pardon?
When the rest of the band returned from their tour in Japan, they found Brian with these very artistically advanced tracks and all their vocal parts planned out for them in advance. They were a little taken aback.
We were a surfing group when we left the country. You know, basically, and we came back to this new music, to a whole new concept in music. And it took some getting used to.
But what really took some getting used to were the extensive vocal sessions that Brian directed.
The vocal sessions for Wouldn't It Be Nice were exquisite torture.
We must have done the backgrounds 30 times.
Every voice had to be right. Every voice and its resonance and tonality had to be right. And then you might, the next day, completely throw that out and we might have to do it over again. I always felt that, wow, I mean, you know, who's going to hear it but somebody with ears the pitch of a dog? You know, they could hear high, you know, whistles beyond the human ear, but Brian had those kind of ears.
But it was their record company, Capitol Records, who were the most unsure about Pet Sounds, which at that point had cost about $678,000 in 2024 money. When Brian first showed them this very artistically complex and expensive album, they talked about shelving it. Brian was so offended that he refused to speak at future Capitol meetings, instead bringing along 8 tape recorders with pre-recorded messages like yes, no, can you repeat that? Finally, Capitol agreed to release it. Now, the story that usually gets told at this point is that Pet Sounds flopped and people didn't really like it. And it is true that a lot of Brian's contemporaries frowned upon the album, notably Pete Townshend of The Who, but really it was Capitol Records who frowned upon the album the most and had the least faith in it. Apparently, they put very little effort into promotion, instead focusing their efforts on the artistic triumph, Best of the Beach Boys Volume 1. However, I have found very little promotion for this album in contemporary magazines, whereas Capitol devoted a handful of full-page ads and a full-color gatefold spread to Pet Sounds, so yeah, I don't know. And in fact, Pet Sounds sold quite well. It broke the top 10 on the US Billboard charts, which wasn't quite as good as other Beach Boys sales, much to Capitol's disdain. Still, it sold enough copies by the end of 1967 that it could have been certified as a gold album. Capitol just never got around to signing the paperwork to actually certify it as such. In fact, the album was received quite warmly at the time, enough to garner a reputation of being a pop revolution, especially in the UK, where the album shot to number 2.
It floored me. I thought it was fantastic, and it gave the Beatles great inspiration, and it gave a challenge to them too.
Pet Sounds prompted visits and congratulatory phone calls from Paul, John, and George, and served as a direct inspiration to Paul McCartney's personal favorite song, Here, There, and Everywhere.
Pet Sounds, Beach Boys, that was the album flipped me. Still does, actually, still one of my favorite albums of all time. Just because the musical invention on that is like, wow. Me, I just thought, oh dear me, this is the album of all time. What the hell are we gonna do?
I was raised in an agnostic family, and Pet Sounds actually gave me faith.
Andrew Loog Oldham, manager and producer of the Rolling Stones, went so far as to call Pet Sounds the Scheherazade of pop, a classical magnum opus by Rimsky-Korsakov, who's the Bumblebee guy. Anyway, now everybody was talking about how Brian Wilson was a genius, and this was a huge blessing and a huge burden for Brian. This appellation was in fact started by Beatles publicist Derek Taylor, who made a whole big media racket about it that has continued to the present day. Now, a lot of people would stop here and say, well, they made it the greatest album of all time, that's great. But, of course, Brian's not most people, and he said, you know, what if I did something even better than Pet Sounds? This endeavor would take Brian across 4 different recording studios, using up over 90 hours of recording tape and spending something like $97,000 to $727,000 in 2024 money. Oh, and I forgot to mention, this is all for one song.
I was walking to the market with my mother, and a dog barked at her. And I said, that dog barked at you, Mom? And she goes, well, he probably picked up the vibrations and didn't like me, so he barked. And he goes, some dogs bark at some people, but won't bark at other people. So she said it was the vibrations that he picked up. So from there, I went and I said, Good Vibrations.
Good Vibrations is the first song to use what we would call a modular recording technique. Let me explain what that means. For a normal song in the 60s, you just go to the studio with your instruments and your vocalists and you record it from start to finish. Verse, chorus, bridge, maybe add some more instruments or vocals later, but most of it was done in that one session. For Good Vibrations, Brian had musicians come in for a session and record just a few short snippets. Then he'd have them come in another day in another studio and have them record other snippets. Later, he would meticulously stitch these clips together, more like editing a movie than a pop song. And this was no easy feat in an age where you had to physically cut and paste recording tape with a literal razor blade and splicing tape. Creating a song this way took a lot of time and required a lot of studio sessions. How many exactly? Well, here's a rundown of all the Good Vibrations sessions. On February 18, a complete track is recorded during the Pet Sounds sessions, with a rough vocal and a jaw harp recorded on March 3rd. This version features the verse used in the final track, as well as unused lyrics by Pet Sounds lyricist Tony Asher. April 9th, a second version is recorded from start to finish. May 4th, Brian decides against recording a complete track, instead recording in segments. A third version of the chorus and a new bridge and fade sequence are recorded. This bridge makes it into the final track, as well as the construction of the fade sequence. On May 24th, a fourth version of the chorus is recorded with castanets, as well as a bridge featuring timpani and flutes. May 27th, a fifth version of the chorus and fade sequence featuring fuzz bass, and a second version of the timpani flute bridge. This fade sequence makes it to the final track. June 2nd, called Inspiration on the tape box, a sixth version of the chorus and fade are recorded with prominent tack piano, as well as a new bridge featuring fuzz tone bass. The version of the chorus from this session makes it to the final track. June 16, a new version of the verse, chorus, and bridge are recorded. This is the third version of the verse and the seventh version of the chorus. June 18, a redo of the previous session. This is the fourth version of the verse and the eighth version of the chorus. Brian is almost happy with what he's recorded so far, but he gets discouraged and changes his mind at the last minute. He doesn't work on the song again for over a month. August 24th, a version of the song is edited together with new vocals, including Humpy-Dum vocals over the fuzz tone bridge. There are a couple of canceled sessions on August 29th and the 31st, possibly sessions where Brian tried some ideas and gave up before recording anything. September 1st, called Persuasion on the tape box, the final version of the second bridge is recorded, getting rid of the fuzz bass and opting for a slower church organ sound. This is the last piece that makes it to the final track. September 12th, vocals recorded over final track edit. September 21st, more vocals are added, possibly the unused Humpy-Dum vocals over the second bridge, as well as the iconic cello and electro-theremin overdubs on the choruses. September 26th, the final mixdown is completed. To save time, Brian cuts out the extended Humpy-Dum section on the second bridge and makes the ending fade out really quickly. So to recap, this is roughly over 30 snippets over the course of 19 sessions, spanning from February to September of 1966. When the Beach Boys heard this track for the first time, they liked it, but they were immediately concerned that it would be too avant-garde. I mean, this was a musical mosaic with chopping cello sounds and a freaky electro-theremin. Brian became very unsure of himself, asking for constant suggestions and never feeling happy with the track. Apparently, Brian tried to release it and then took it back the same day. At another point, he almost gave the song to a different artist to record. Sometimes he would show up to recording sessions, try out a few ideas, and leave without recording anything. It was only with encouragement from one of Brian's new friends, the very hip David Anderle, more on him later, that he found the strength to finish and release the song.
It was a bizarre record. Our company, our record company said, Capitol Records goes, that's too long. They said it's too long. It was 3:35, you know. We said, no, let me logically convince you that this record, we didn't think, and then after we had gotten people over to the, over to our houses listening, people were flipping. They're going, whoa, that's a great fucking record, man. And I said, but our company doesn't want to release it. And they said, well, you shouldn't listen to your company, force them to put it out, you know? And that goddamn record went out and went to #1 in the nation, in the whole nation. And all because of that theremin and the cello.
Well, Brian was right. On October 10th, 1966, 9 months after recording began, Good Vibrations was unleashed and it became a worldwide sensation. It was their biggest single to date, being their first record to sell over 1 million copies. It would reach 2 million in a matter of weeks. People were talking about the Beach Boys in the same breath as the Beatles and The Who, Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones. They were seen as groundbreaking pioneers of the burgeoning psychedelic movement. When the touring segment of the Beach Boys arrived in the UK, they were met with the same rapturous fervor that the Beatles had been greeted with in the US just a couple years before. Girls tearing at their clothes, security protecting them from rabid fans. Caught up in their success, they even bought 4 Rolls-Royce limos, including one for Brian. Although when Brian learned that his limo wouldn't ship to him for 3 months, he went ahead and bought an interim Rolls-Royce in the US, one that apparently used to belong to John Lennon. Confident and sitting pretty, the band were ready to return to the US and kick butt in the studio with whatever tracks Brian had come up with for them. The music they would encounter there would be utterly unrecognizable to anything they had done before.